Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for coming and welcome to the last of Local Wisdom, Global Insights, Fostering Cooperation in Conflict Research Beyond Borders talk series. I'm Efe Tokdemir, Associate Professor of International Relations at Bilkent University and Director of Research at Center for Foreign Policy and Peace Research. Once again, this is just a reminder that this workshop is sponsored by the Center for Foreign Policy and Peace Research and its journal, Azimuth, a journal of foreign policy and peace. Both the center and the journal has long fostered scholarly dialogue between the center and the periphery, or global south and global north, however you would like to define, and serves as a platform for scholars from the global south to enrich the field of international relations and facilitate the global dialogue with insights and perspectives from diverse regions. In line with this goal today, our final guest speaker is Kristian Gleditsch. He is the Regius Professor of Political Science in the Department of Government at the University of Essex, Director of Michael Nicholson Center for Conflict and Cooperation, and a research associate at the International Peace Research Institute, Oslo, as you well know, PRIO. His research interests include conflict and cooperation, democratization, and special dimensions of social and political processes. Well, he has published numerous articles in top journals, including the American Journal of Political Science, American Political Science Review, Comparative Political Studies, International Organizations, Journal of Conflict Resolution, Journal of Peace Research, Journal of Politics, and it goes on and on. Kristian is one of the scholars in our world and in our era that cannot be defined actually by just simply listing his publications. And speaking of data and the importance of local data dialogue and these kinds of things, I must say that he was among the creators of multiple data sets we conflict scholars use almost daily basis. So I guess this is why he's one of the best fits for this kind of a workshop. So without further ado, Kristian, thank you very much again for coming here and for presenting your expertise. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Efe. And thanks for the invitation to a very interesting workshop. I've been asked to talk about future prospects in conflict studies and what might lie ahead. This is an extremely interesting topic, and it encourages both prediction and reflection on the sort of factors that may influence future scholarship. So in attempting to provide a possible answer, I'd like to talk about 3 different approaches to forecasting and prediction, and then some key factors that I think will affect demand and supply of conflict studies. So the first perspective and a common concern about prediction is that it's actually very difficult to do, especially about the future. This is probably a apocryphal quote, and has been attributed to a range of individuals, including Niels Bohr and Yogi Berra. So a common approach is that if you want to forecast something, then we should look at past data. We should try to fit trends and see if we could extend these into the future. In many cases, this is a useful approach. It's often difficult to beat, but whenever we get financial statements, they always tell us that past behavior is not always a reliable guide to future performance. And there are some that would put it even stronger than this. So Nicholas Taleb, he would argue that the only thing that we can reliably predict are so-called white swans that we can observe more easily, and potentially expect to forecast using deterministic methods with less uncertainty. But these also have less impact. The key thing that matters are black swans, namely rare events where uncertainty is very large, and the probability distribution is such that it's really hard to forecast. A second perspective on prediction does not question our limited ability to predict, but focuses instead on the value of trying. The originator of the International Future simulation model, Barry Hughes, has expressed this in my view very nicely. He's argued that we cannot predict the future, but we need to act as if we can. This enables us to think about future outcomes, what would make them more likely, and then prepare ourselves to meet their implications. The best way to do this is to try to make structured scenario-based forecasts rather than a single prediction or forecast. So now we can consider assumptions and models about relationships, and we can examine a wide series of forecasts in the different scenarios. And this often gives us a useful delineation of plausible alternatives given different assumptions that we can then compare and evaluate. So this kind of simulation forecast has been used in the IFS model to consider different conflict, governance, and development outcomes, and is, of course, the way that we tend to reason about future events in things like climate change and its potential implications. The third approach to predictions is one that acknowledges fundamental constraints on accuracy in what we can predict, but tries to look to see whether there are certain ways that may allow us to predict relatively better, and if there are certain methods and types of comparison that can allow us to predict better. Here, Philip Tetlock has done very important work on forecasting on international events. He's asked experts to rate the likelihood of different outcomes and then evaluate the record later. When these studies were first published, the results suggested that experts seemed to be much more confident in their ability to predict than what was warranted by the actual results, and they often failed to do better than simple statistical algorithms. But there's important differences in the type of predictions that people make. And Tetlock distinguished between what he called hedgehogs, which tended to emphasize one key thing. They were overall less likely to be right, but they sometimes did get big things right by being more confident in prospects for change or theory. Foxes that are more athletic reasoners, they tended to generally do better by focusing on many things, but they were also less able to deal with fundamental change, and they tend to be less confident in any special prediction. Now, if experts aren't very good at prediction, then that might be seen as a reason to try to dismiss it altogether. Instead of doing this, Tetlock has turned to a useful research agenda where he looks at if it's possible to predict better. This is described in his super forecasting book and the Good Judgment Project, where they conducted tournaments to try to identify the type of traits of those individuals that predict better. The things that they've identified include the ability to break problems into parts, try to reason about the likelihood of individual components, then look at what we know about the likelihood of these things, and then we can use Bayesian reasoning to try to come up with more structured and better predictions. Now, the future conflict studies, that would obviously be influenced by demand factors, such as conflicts and events that call for an explanation and may reorient scholarly attention. So, for instance, when Russia invaded Ukraine, this has led to a renewed attention to territorial conflict and less attention to previous topics such as civil war. To try to forecast the conflict landscape is a really broad topic, and I don't think I can adequately cover this here. But I wanted to make 3 observations that I think are important. The first is that to try to extrapolate trends is actually difficult even when we had observed data, partly for the reasons laid out by Taleb. So if severe conflict is a rare event and it follows extreme value distributions, then we would need to have really long time series to say anything about trends in conflict, such as whether the risk of a severe war has declined or materially changed. Now, we may be able to say more about other features, such as conflict outbreak, or have varying degrees of confidence in trend that we think will affect conflicts. But the point stands that if we think of the present as a draw, that even for observed data, we need to consider some kind of underlying model and uncertainty before we can conclude about trends. The second point I want to make is that conflict prediction is a very vibrant area of research. And in my view, at least, there's good evidence that we're getting better at predicting conflict events in the short term. we're getting better at thinking systematically about scenarios, and we're starting to incorporate some of the lessons on how we can predict better developed by Fetlock and others. The third point that I wanted to make is that sometimes how anticipation could be used in conflict management effort and what they might tell us about that did not occur could be as important as what we can predict. There's some work on civil war outbreaks by Beardsley, Cunningham, and White, which looks at whether UN action or attention to potential conflicts could make violence less likely, and they provide some evidence that is consistent with this. At this point, I'd like to shift to what I think of as supply factors that influence conflict studies and highlight 4 key and possibly related factors that I think would be important in the future. The first one is scholars themselves as a factor that affects scholarship. If you look at data on participation in research, as it's ISA membership or submissions or publications in a journal, then I think it's pretty clear that we can see a increase in participation by researchers outside the West or traditional major players. And if you look at substantive topics or countries that are studied, then there's also evidence that we see at least increasing attention to other areas and topics and major powers and traditional security concern. Now, there are many reasons why this may be the case, but if you think that the traditional barriers to research may be decreasing, then there's going to be more opportunities for more people to participate in research. At the present, it's much easier to get access to publications, computing resources, more data sources are open. And it's at least in principle easier to get training that would allow people to participate, even if some equities still persist. So overall, I think that as a discipline gets more global and inclusive, that it will also have a broader and more useful research focus. And of course, a lot of research is collaborative. So rather than distinguishing between individuals in different countries, we often have research in broader teams that includes a wide range of different types of countries and researchers. A second factor, which I think is important, is data availability. I have written previously about how progress in research is often driven by new data becoming available. Now, of course, collection efforts need to have some theoretical priors and assumption, but it's precisely the advent of new data that allows us to interrogate these, and this in turn allows us to develop theories in ways that often generate progress. So there's an article in PLS that has looked at influencing conflict studies. And if we look at the path that they present based on citation data, then we can see that many of the key nodes that they identify as influential indeed are data articles, including the polity and the Uppsala data. So I think it's very likely that we will see growth in data. And this is, of course, also closely related to the globalization and broadening of the disciplines. So as we get more scholars that have detailed knowledge of other areas and countries, then that can help us get access to new data. And I think there's evidence that these kind of country insights have had a transformative effect on my studies of civil war. It also allows people in conflict countries to be active researchers and not just human subjects or informants on conflict situation. Now, as data sources get more specialized and focused on specific countries, it may be that we find more divergence and heterogeneity, and the generalization would seem less obvious. But I think we can address some of that by using approaches such as meta-analysis to try to integrate study and try to understand the source of heterogeneity and what different studies may be cases of in a more general theory. A third factor is methods. I think there will be important development in methods that will impact the field. It's clear that the social sciences is undergoing something of a revolution based on artificial intelligence, machine learning, and large language models. In forecasting, there's evidence that these approaches can help improve prediction. And it's likely that things like machine learning and adaptive methods may become more central relative to traditional ways of hypothesis testing for covariates. But I think one of the key impacts of this is likely to be on the data development side. So traditionally, data has been developed using human coding, often under graduate assistants. This is very expensive to do, and there are some limitations of human coding in the human biases that we're subject to, as well as variation in judgment across different coders. There are many efforts now to use machine learning or artificial intelligence to generate data, for instance, through automated coding of event data from the news media report. This potentially promises more data at lower costs, and in some cases, it could be helpful to overcome some human biases or idiosyncrasies across coders. So a recent example of this is the Plover project that's been supported by the Political Instability Task Force. But this example aside, I think it's likely that the approach itself and computer-assisted coding will be more influential in the future. So having AI or machine learning assisted data will not necessarily create an unambiguous new wealth in data that fuels progress. If data coded from media reports, then it's going to reflect what is reported and what is not. And there's a host of implications when it comes to representativity and possible biases. Now, I think in some cases, it's actually possible to try to model the impact and find methods to address implications of this. But we need to keep in mind that the issues that we're often concerned about in small data sets, such as representativity and biases, in many cases tend to be even more central when we deal with big data sets based on availability. So one thing that I've thought about recently, which I think is worrying, is that as we have more digitalization, we might actually have an erosion of many of the sources that we relied on in the past. So if key political decisions are made on WhatsApp or cell phones, then it may well be that we have less historical archive material in the future than we did in the past. And if newspapers seem to have correspondence and go out of business, then we may have only online sources that essentially represent the same information. So even if we think we have more reports, we might actually have less depth and diversity in coverage, even if they're nominally more. The final supply factor that I want to stress is what I think of as scholarship and dissemination. So if we have digital technologies, then we have many more opportunities for dissemination, and the production costs should in principle be lower. But I think it's clear that we're also facing a crisis in traditional publication money. A lot of the money in publishing is disappearing. This is less support for journal. Alternative financing models for open access create other challenges. And we also have a growing submission pool that leads to unsustainable demand on editors and reviewers that ultimately have limited incentives to engage in these activities. So I think it's likely that in addition to traditional journals, which are often slow, there may be an increased use of a preprint model. This allows us to make things available quickly. It was very influential in COVID research when time was of the essence. And then we can engage in sort of post-publication discussion using platforms such as PubPeer or Twitter. Now, speed can have advantages, but I think there are also challenges when we move away from peer review. And I'd like to think that editors like myself, in some cases, could have added value that may help to improve research. And these are some of the things that we may lose out on. Finally, there are also limitations in digital communication. It's easy to work online with people that you already know, but it's very difficult to get to know new people. A lot of valuable academic exchange and basic collaboration often occurs outside formal presentation. So in a presentation like this, I cannot continue discussion during the coffee break. And if we're concerned that cost or other kind of concerns is going to present travel to academic conferences or the prospects for this decline, then I think we'll have challenges in how we can maintain communities and build relationships between researchers in a more digital discipline. Now, I don't want to deny the challenges in predicting, and sometimes there's a tendency to try to choose standards that make you look more able to predict the future than you actually are. So there's a famous saying that the Trotsky's farsightedness proved that very few of the predictions that he had made had actually come true. So what I've tried to do is to emphasize some trends and factors that I think are likely to have an influence on conflict studies and why they matter. But there's a lot of uncertainty about this. I also don't see this as prescriptions for how we ought to conduct research. Ultimately, there will be a great deal of variation, and different people will have different preferences in how they engage in research. It's likely that we're going to have ups and downs in interest and approaches. There have been times in conflict studies where formal theory has been valued more than empirical research. And at other times, we have focused on certain type of analysis, such as causal inference, perhaps at the expense of descriptive knowledge or more observational data. So maybe it's warranted not to have too much confidence in the one single forecast, but I think that reflecting on where we're going could be useful to understand where we are now, as well as how we may prepare ourselves for what the future of conflict research looks like. And with that, I'd like to end my introduction, and I thank again for the opportunity to come to this workshop.
Thank you very much, Kristian, for this great presentation. Now, if it's okay for you, we will proceed with the questions that our workshop team prepared. And while we were actually coming up with this idea and organizing this session, we had some questions in our mind, and it will be great to hear your answers, hear your insights regarding these topics. So even though you touched upon some of these issues, I would like to reiterate and re-ask some of these, some of the aspects of these issues. To start with, well, we know that, the large chunk of data when it comes to conflict studies is not coming from the Western countries. It's not United States or United Kingdom or France, Germany. I'm not saying that our data sets are not covering these countries. Indeed, they cover, but the large chunk of the data, or more interesting data, is coming from, with high variation data, coming from the quote-unquote global south. Again, I don't want to delve into the conceptualization here, but you understand me. So if this is the case, what is the current landscape in conflict studies, concerning the collection of primary data, engagement with local knowledge, and collaboration with global south in that sense? How do you see that? And especially in your case, I wondered from a historical perspective as well. How did it start? What were the state of data collection at the very first day, and now how it evolved over time? And is it going to a good direction or bad direction according to you?
Yeah, again, these are very good questions. I think it's certainly fair to say that what we can think of as the earliest data collection effort were often started by people that were based in what we, for lack of a better term, might call the West or the global North. So if you take someone like Richardson, we had people that were interested in saying something about comparative aspects of war and peace. And then they tried to see what kind of resources do we have that would document instances of this. And I think some of these efforts are actually truly impressive. If we go back and look at the work that Richardson did, it's an incredible amount of detail and description. And it really had an extremely influential effect on the Correlates of War project, to the extent that we can see that a lot of the things that made it into the database was really based more or less directly on the things that Richardson had collected. I think at that point, there were also some constraints in the way that the data were collected that may have limited their usefulness for certain purposes. So when I was interested in studying democratization and so on, at that point, you might think of conflict from like a national perspective, and it was difficult to use some of the historical CAL data because this was oriented towards a perspective on the international system where the focus was on the major powers and the key players. So in certain part of the world, such as Persia, there's not even the consideration of Persia as a state until it's recognized by UK and France as the major powers. I think as we become more interested in comparative analysis and study of civil war, there's become perhaps a premium on detailed knowledge of individual countries. So at some point after the first wave of cross-national studies, we then see more effort to use field research and going to the field in order to collect original data sources that might tell us something about a key question. I couldn't say that I have that this is something that I've engaged in so much myself. I have the impression that sometimes it tends to be a bit like academic tourism. So people may go somewhere and they see what kind of source they can find, and then they come back and say, I have this unique information that no one has ever looked at before. But I think there's some evidence now that the model may be changing a bit more towards one of more active elaboration and participation. So if you go to a country, then do not just sort of be interested in their data, but try to talk to scholars that are there, possibly work collaboratively with people and see if you could do something in return that might lead to academic exchange. So in my own work, I couldn't say that I've done this so much on the data side, but I've definitely had very interesting collaboration with scholars in countries that have had conflict experiences that have helped bring important perspectives to where the data come from and how the knowledge may be useful that I wouldn't have had if I'd been working just with colleagues in the global north. So I think it's a good development that we have more diversity in data description and what the focus is. Maybe one downside is that we don't have the same kind of common concepts of what it is that we're trying to study. If you look at something like demonstrations and protests, that's where this may become most apparent. So we have a lot of data sets that claim to look at protests. We have some that simply scrape everything that's reported as a protest in news media sources. If you do that, then by far the most protests we have would be in countries like France and so on. And then we have others that try to look at what we can think of as protest of the government. Here, the news events report may be much more rare, and we have very different type of protests than what we see in a democracy where protest is part of perhaps conventional participation. So I think more data development is a very good thing, but sometimes there's a risk that data development efforts might run ahead of concept formation, or that we're not very good at thinking about how conceptualization may differ across data sources.
I see. Thank you very much. So, I mean, furthering the topic, in the previous talks as well, we discussed this, and I really wonder where you stand in this discussion. Well, on one hand, as you also explained and summarized, we have these new technologies regarding data collection as well. I mean, artificial intelligence, the machine learning techniques. We scrape data from Twitter, I mean, location-wise data and everything. In our previous talks, some of the participants, some of the scholars said that this is good for fostering collaboration actually between Global South and North. And some others said that, well, it might not be that good for this collaboration, because right now you may not need the expertise of, I mean, the local expertise or local knowledge for it, or even if you need for it for a high quality work. Well, I mean, to some extent, it will be a leeway for many researchers, many scholars to avoid this, how to say, costly part. After all, I mean, going to the field, staying in the field, understanding the context, we should say it's costly, not money-wise, but time-wise as well. And these methods can actually help us skip that, which means that so-called armchair sociology, or here, let's say armchair conflict scholarship, might indeed get more powerful. So where do you stand it? I mean, do you think that these technologies, these methodological advancements can actually push us further to collaborate more with each other? Or like instead, I mean, isolating us into our boxes and like, I mean, through internet, through our computers, collect data and no need for a local knowledge or expertise?
Well, I think it's something which cuts in many directions, as you've indicated. On the positive side, these technologies might actually help people that have fewer resources to engage in more ambitious efforts, because we don't need to hire extensive amounts of undergraduate coders. We may be able to access like a wealth of information without necessarily costing an arm and a leg. And that could make it easier for more people to participate. You don't need to have these large grants or connections in order to participate. Could it bypass like local collaborators? So instead of working with people that know certain languages, can you simply rely on automated translation and so on? I think one way to think about it would be what's sort of the relative benefits of one versus the other. It seems to me that one of the things I'd be interested in the first place is how would the data that you code or the answers that you reach differ depending on whether you use one approach or the other? And if you know something about that, then that might tell us something about relative costs and benefits. I think actually, if you look at scientific influence, I saw a graph in The Economist the other day that looked at highly cited researchers and where they're located. And that's quite interesting in that you see a big decline in researchers based in US, EU, or Britain, and a large increase in researchers that are based elsewhere. And one way to think about this is that maybe it's partly these technologies and the lower barriers that I talked about that allows people to participate, so that it's not necessarily a question of people in established areas replacing scholars elsewhere, but rather that people in established area who should feel challenged or face competition from people elsewhere. So, I mean, I said at the beginning that in general, there's a lot of path dependence in research and research strengths. But we don't have to go back that many decades where something that was a very strong environment might have declined relative to others. There's no natural law that says that just because conflict research was something which was dominated by North America and some European countries, but that would necessarily be the case in the future. And there's a sort of more room for new entrants and people outside traditional academic institutions to make big contributions to conflict research. And that, I think, is probably a good thing. If we look at the sciences, we've gone from Nobel Prizes being won by European universities to elite universities on the East Coast, whereas now they're more likely to be won by a specialized research lab and sometimes people that work outside traditional academic institutions. So one way to think about this is that there are opportunities to do research outside traditional manner. And that, I think, is probably a good thing.
Thank you very much. One more question. Maybe it will be a bit of personal, story question, but I guess, as I said at the very introduction, you were one of the scholars who is most experienced when it comes to data collection. So I wonder if you have any personal evaluations, let's say, in the sense that, well, or any stories comparing past and today, in the sense that, well, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, I was collecting this type of a data set, and actually these were the coding rules. This is how we practiced it, how we executed the operation. And now we are 20 years later, 30 years later, indeed, I'm working on this type of a project, or I heard some others are working on this type of a project, and it's radically different in good ways and in bad ways. I wonder if you have any, comparisons as a very, experienced scholar as of now.
I definitely have experiences. I don't know if the lessons are always obvious. It's not always so easy to go back and change them. So for some of the projects that I worked on, I often had like a clear purpose that I was interested in. And so I wanted to see, well, so we don't have data on this, but could we get data on this? And is it actually possible to find information on this? And I found that in many cases, it was possible to interrogate assumptions or get more detailed information on things that people often assume to be true or made statements about. In so doing, it may often be the case later that you can come up with questions about conceptualization and how do you best use particular coding rules. And that's often very difficult to do retrospectively. I think we're getting better at this over time. So many projects now often work in a good way, first doing a pilot. And then based on this, we then revise the coding rules and try to come up with blind spots and ways to address them. But it's difficult, again, sometimes to know these lessons ahead of time. And I suspect we have many legacy projects that are not being updated because there's no easy way to integrate them with a new effort. Right now, there's a lot of interest in event data and machine learning and so on. I suspect that we will learn things about useful standards for this later on. And again, then we will face some of the challenges that it becomes difficult to go back and look at other things and try to retrofit lessons into data that are already being collected. But if there is one lesson, then that is that always save your sources and keep as much information as possible. Because for many people, it's more useful to have a list or a discussion of the information that was used to code something than just the final decision. And if you're interested in how coding rules might affect an answer, then having these kind of references can often help understand how the data were generated in a way that's much better than an abstract decision describing general coding rules rather than specific. So machine learning, hard coding, try to keep as much references to the source that you have and as much information as possible because it's likely to be very useful for end users.
Thank you very much. One last question from me, and then I will then direct the questions from the audience. Personally speaking, I define myself as a behavioral international relations scholar. So in my work, when it comes to conflict studies, most of my work are also somehow aiming to measure the attitudes and behaviors of individuals regarding some conflict dynamics. Of course, I'm not saying that I'm not doing observational data. On the contrary, I'm also doing, I'm working with large and observational data sets. In such talks, I always realize that all these methodological advances and technological developments they somehow bring solutions to data collection, but this is mostly observational large and data collection. Now we have a better sense of the location of the conflict, the timing of the conflict, the size of the conflict, the actors of the conflict. But when it comes to the behavioral aspects, attitudinal aspects, I mean, individuals, ordinary citizens, how they react to that, how they, think about that, how they respond to that. Well, I'm not saying that they cannot be responded with these new advancements, but it's limited. Most of the time when it comes to that, it's the Twitter data. It was once Twitter data, very popular. I mean, all of us scrape data from the Twitter, try to understand, but we also know that when it comes to conflict data, I mean, the accounts are banned. People cannot see most of the time, they cannot see the accounts of these groups, or they cannot properly react, or I mean, these kinds of problems. So I was wondering, and I cannot find a clear answer in my mind. Maybe you have it. In that sense, do you think that these advancements can also help the researchers like me to further the knowledge in the field? Or on the contrary, these advancements require more and more knowledge from the fields, the local knowledge, to make it more, how to say, comprehensive and complete?
I'm not sure if I have a clear answer, but I certainly understand the challenges that you refer to. So, yes, you're right that a lot of the, at least like the general expansion of conflict data often tends to focus very narrowly on events or things that happen. Whereas a lot of the theories that we have is often about individual decisions, what people's actual views and evaluations are, and how that in turn affects their willingness to do the things that we then expect these events to be reflected. These attitudes or views or behaviors are difficult to study directly. Sometimes people try to study them in ways that may not be fully reflective of them. So I think the idea of doing experiments and so on are very good, but it doesn't follow that the internal validity that you achieve in trying to set up some experiments to emulate some kind of treatment that you argue would be analogous to something that you're interested in conflict processes necessarily extends to decisions and behavior in conflict. I think there's prospects for doing more work on the actual actors in conflict. We could do surveys of individuals or try to identify people that actually were involved. In that case, the kind of challenges to data that we deal with, they're often those that are confronted with historians. So we have to engage in source criticism. Why do people say this? Do they have incentives to represent this differently? Or is there a risk that what they say now was influenced by what happened afterwards and may not reflect what they thought at the time? But I think you're right that it's probably difficult to get completely around things that reflect decisions and individual attitudes without some attention to the ground and trying to see how we could get useful information about actors that would speak to this. Experiments are helpful, but they're not some kind of magic solution that bypasses all the problems from studying events.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Kristian. So we have two questions on the chat. Let me read it for you and the audience. From Gizem Kaya. How do you evaluate the ethical aspect of conflict prediction research? Some conflicts result from mass protests demanding human rights and freedom. If we predict these protests and cooperate with the government, what will be the future of protests be? I mean, it reminds me this, the Tom Cruise movie, Minority Report. I mean, I guess it's somehow related to that kind of a concept as well. What do you think about that?
Well, it's certainly possible that there could be cases where if you can predict high risk of conflict, then this could give some actor an opportunity to find out ways to apply repressive tactics, for instance, that would then undermine the ability of someone to express dissent, or could be used to gain advantage from one side of the conflict or another. I think most of the work in conflict prediction at the present does not really offer very strong predictions of that type that I think lead to ethical questionable things. And that's partly because what they tend to be good at is predicting that there's a lot of conflict in places where we already have conflict, rather than things that could be leveraged into tactical advantage for one actor or the other. But it's important to be aware that there could be situations where these things happen, and then we need to be guided by appropriate concerns for what potential ethical implications could be. Now, I think ethics is important, but sometimes we tend to adopt the standards of medical research when perhaps the ethical concerns and standards for research have some similarities with what we have outside academia in areas such as journalism. Another issue which I think comes up with some questions of large data is that there could be questions about sort of privacy concern, and that if you have a lot of information about things, then you may be able to infer information that could identify individuals. Now, some of these things are already done by tech companies and so on, but we sometimes use stricter criteria for academic research based on the kind of standards that are appropriate in medical research. So I think it would be useful if conflict research could try to think more systematically about ethical concerns and standards, and that might help us to think about good practices that would be used in research. I can't say that this is something that I've done a lot of work on myself, but I think I've become more concerned on that many things that is used in conflict settings, such as journalistic accounts, have ethical implications. It requires standards, but the standards may not be the same as those that are applicable in medical research, which tends to be what is often reviewed in standard procedures.
Thank you very much. Another question. If I'm not wrong, Dr. Mehmet Erdemarslan, an Essex graduate. Hi, Kristian. Great talk as always. My question is about the increasing emphasis on causal inference in social sciences, and in particular about how conflict studies is being affected by this trend. By the very nature of the phenomenon, for researchers of conflict studies, there might be less opportunities for achieving identification compared to some other research areas, and I was wondering your thoughts on whether this can make conflict research seems less credible to other audiences or decrease their relative chances of publishing their work in top-level outlets. I guess this is a great question. It's becoming more and more rightly popular, the causal inference, especially when it comes to conflict research as well. And identification problems are always there because of the very, nested nature of the conflict, the very complex, and the nature of the conflict.
No, I think this is a very good question. Let me start by saying that trying to improve causal inference is a worthy aim. I have nothing against causal inference. Some of my best friends are causal inference theorists. But there is a risk that because there's such a premium on strategies for causal inference, that we could get a research strategy where people look for situations where they can find an instrument or some identification strategy, And then they go and look for something that this could be applied to, so that you choose your instrument first and then your research question. Now, I think this could be a great way to often write papers that have better chance of being published, because there's such a premium on having the cleanest possible coastal identification. The downside of it is that there are many questions that are important and interesting. And the fact that there are challenges to coastal influence and we don't have a clean strategy doesn't mean that we shouldn't do them. Instead, we should try to think about what are the plausible challenges and what are the strategies by which we can do as best as possible, even if we don't have 100% foolproof strategy for coastal influence, even if such a thing exists. I think sometimes there's a tendency that the questions that people focus on using coastal influence strategy are often cases where sort of the arguments in theory and findings are relatively well known. If coastal influence confirm what observational studies showed before, then we've learned something through coastal inference. But my personal view is that it would be a very narrow view of concrete research to privilege only one type of study at the expense of others. But it doesn't necessarily follow that that's how all the viewers would see something. I also think that in economics, there's some, at least in some areas, some attention now to some of the limitations of coastal influence studies and how much has been learned by RCT. Not that these things are never useful, but whether they really can be applied as the only kit in the toolbox is more questionable.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks again. I guess we are done with the questions as of now. And regarding the time management, actually, it's a place that we need to maybe end the conversation. It has been 1 hour already. Thank you very much, Kristian. Thank you very much to our participants, our audience. And this was just a reminder, this was last of our workshop series, and Professor Kristian Gleditsch actually, I mean, helped us to wrap up the topic in general and show us the possible roadmaps and the future of conflict studies, and kind enough to answer our questions. You can find all these talks actually uploaded to our YouTube channel, the Center for Foreign Policy and Peace Research YouTube channel. Not only this one, but the previous videos as well, in order to reach the talks, the other events. Thanks again. It was a pleasure to have you here, Kristian. Hope to see you soon. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you very much. I hope to see as many of you as possible at another occasion.
Bye.
Yeah.